inaugural episode of Behind the Culture with head coach Jim Flanery. Coach, first of all, thank you for joining us. I wanted to do this to give everybody an opportunity to get a little bit more behind-the-scenes information about yourself and your history and how you've created what has been our most important phrase over the last 12 years that I've been here, which is Creighton culture. And that's the thing that draws players to this university for women's basketball. It's what's yielded 4 consecutive years, or hopefully 4 consecutive years, of the NCAA tournament. And during the time that I've been here, it has been a joy to work with this team, and I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to learn more about what you do to create that culture.
That sounds good. It's going to be involved, I'm guessing, to get to every piece of what embodies that. But yeah, I'm happy to do it because I think it'll be good for me to be reflective too about some of the things that we do. Some are, you hope a lot of them are intentional, but some are unintentional. And sometimes when something unintentional yields good results, you're like, oh, maybe we should continue to do that, even though you didn't really intend to do it in the first place. So this will be good for me too.
For everyone who's tuning in, don't worry, we're not going to have Flan talk for 3 hours straight, which would be a concern if I just continue to ask you questions. We're going to keep these to about 20 to 30 minutes, and it's going to be something that we do weekly. A little bit about this season, but a little bit reflective. So we're going to split these up, not necessarily 50-50, but we're going to try to focus halfway on the reflective culture and then a little bit about this season. So we'll do the easier stuff now. The Jays right now off to a good start after a difficult opening. We started off 1-2, but bouncing back and are currently entering the game with Marquette 12-3, and then the opportunity, regardless of the outcome against the Golden Eagles. It's been a good start to the Big East season and puts you in good position for that 4th consecutive NCAA tournament. What did you do to refocus this team to get them back to where they could play and if not reaching their potential, drawing closer to their potential?
Sure. Well, the first thing I said when the schedule was being finalized was that the first 4 games were really tough. We were playing 4 teams that went to the NCAA tournament last year, 2 home, 2 road. We ended up losing both the road games at South Dakota State and at Kansas State. So I thought the Nebraska game was huge to come back to Omaha 1-2 after not really performing very well at all against Kansas State, to come back and get a really good win against a team that went to the NCAA tournament and is your in-state rival. I thought that was a big one. So I don't know that we were that far off through the first 3 games, but certainly there were some things that needed to be fixed, and just because we weren't really very competitive against Kansas State even. And then South Dakota State's a game we led for 2.5 quarters and, just didn't finish the job. So some of it's maybe having to go back and understand that there are things that we're going to have a little bit smaller margin for error on this year than in the past, but some of it is just based on the schedule and how it laid out, where I think, after those first 4 games, the schedule became more manageable. You get confidence because you're winning, and we won a couple tough games in that stretch without necessarily playing our best. But I just think we're a veteran team, so the bumps that we have maybe are not going to be as long as if you have a younger team, or necessarily as pronounced as if you have a younger team. And I think that's kind of what we've seen play out.
As we move into the heart of Big East Conference season, what's the main difference between playing a non-conference schedule and the conference schedule? I think a lot of times we talk about, we get into conference play, but nobody really focuses on what the differences are and why it's a harder game against a team like Providence, who you should on paper beat easily, but it's a game that we were down at halftime. What makes the difference between the conference schedule and the non-con?
Well, the conference schedule is more rhythmic, which in some ways is easier, I think, and better for, again, younger teams. I think mature teams, older teams can handle non-conference, where you might go and play a game for 2 days. If you look at our non-conference schedule, we played our first game at South Dakota State Friday, Drake Monday, at Kansas State Thursday. So we played 3 games in 7 days against 3 really good teams, but then we had an 8-day break before we played Nebraska. So it's a little harder to get into rhythm. you just don't have the, the cookie cutter, 2 days in between this game, then 3 days in between that game and the next game, where once we get in the league, it's a lot of Saturday, Wednesday. So players get a better rhythm, coaches have a better rhythm. And so I think you're going to see a little bit more consistent results maybe. The other piece is that teams in your league know you better than teams in the non-con know you. And again, they have the same prep time that you had. Whereas in the non-conference, we caught Nebraska on 2 days prep, and like I said, we had a full week. So advantage Creighton in that regard. Whereas when you get in the league, it's pretty much everybody's playing on the same days. But the familiarity of, okay, this is what this coach has done historically. These are the players that we know. These are the things that they do that they did a year ago. They've tweaked this and this, but pretty much everything else is what they've historically done. And so I just think there's greater familiarity means it gets a little tougher to score. It gets they just know your stuff better. They're probably a little bit better prepared. And so I think you get games that are a little bit uglier, especially at times. And you got to find ways to win those games.
Flan, one of the things I don't think a lot of people realize is the amount of hours in preparation that coaches and players spend. So give a good guess as you prepare for a team. We're going to go play Seton Hall on the 18th. You're going to have played Marquette this evening. You'll have 2 days of real time to look at film, but how much time are you looking at film of Seton Hall and your coaching staff, and then how do you break down that film for players?
Yeah, good question. So we actually do it a little differently in terms of what our staff does. So Mike Jewett he'll do personnel. So he'll talk through their players and what their tendencies are and what they like to do. Jordan will focus on what we need to do defensively, and Carly will focus on what we need to do offensively to win. So a lot of times the staff will be, well, Mike, you'll have the Seton Hall scout. Carly, you'll have the DePaul scout. Jordan, you'll have the next scout. We break it up so every game, each of those three coaches is involved. And then Jalen kind of helps put it all together. And then Flan does, I watch every team, and I'm there to basically be a sounding board and ask questions, but also, hey, this is what's worked in the past against Seton Hall. This is what I see. So then we collaborate. We get together and we collaborate, the first morning that we can, but I've already laid out a practice plan, but this is what the practice plan looks like. What do you guys think? Where am I missing something? What am I, what are we focusing too much on? What are we not focusing enough on? So we have those kind of conversations. But as far as what I do, I watch film ahead. I'm wired that way. So even as I'm still watching Marquette film, I'm watching Seton Hall film because I don't want to wait until after Marquette to start preparing for Seton Hall. I feel like my brain is big enough to do two at once. The problem when in the non-conference a lot of times when I try to do a 3-for-1. And then I get confused and I'm like, okay, which out-of-bounds plays are these? Are these Syracuse's out-of-bounds plays or Wichita's? And, but I'm a victim of thinking I can do more than I can. But I watch ahead. And then I think there comes a point where you watch. One of the things I do as a head coach is I watch ends of games because I want to know, okay, if it's a close game, what is Marquette going to run in the last 3 minutes? Or what can we do in the last 3 minutes? What have they done historically? Who do they like to have on the floor at the end of a game? That's something that, my assistant coaches aren't doing. And then, the thing that kind of falls by the wayside sometimes is even just watching film of your own team, going back and watching, okay, where were we good against Providence? So I usually move on to the next team, and then if I have time, I play back, okay, what does Creighton need to do better? But it's a lot. to separate, and give yourself a chance. And then you have to. The other thing is, I have a family, so it's like, okay, if Jackson has a game that I want to attend on Monday evening, how do I make sure that I can get to that game, but also that I've watched enough film? So, just like anybody does, you have to organize your work schedule a little bit around your home life and your home schedule. And obviously you make compromises, but I try to be like, okay, I gotta be ready for Seton Hall because I want to go see Jackson's game. And not that takes 5 hours, but you're always trying to identify where are you going to have some home responsibilities and obligations that are going to conflict with what you can do in terms of prepping for an opponent.
I think that ability to balance home life and work and the responsibilities is a good area to segue into history and how you got to Creighton. And not everybody will know, but you started, you were born and raised in Guthrie City, Iowa, correct?
Guthrie Center.
Guthrie Center, Iowa.
Yes.
So yeah, I can't even get the city right.
It's the center of Guthrie County.
Okay.
That's why it's called Guthrie Center.
So how did you come to Creighton itself? Now, eventually, for those of you who don't know Flan's background, we'll quickly go through it. And he came to Creighton as a student, eventually moved into a role as both a golf coach as well as a GA. You played for the men's basketball team, has told countless stories about how he was the scout player that was used for Mitch Richmond. We'll let that story be for another episode, but
Yeah.
we will tell that story where you played Mitch Richmond for the team and how the coach was so enamored with your performance that he had to replace you. But we'll get to that another time. Let's talk about the journey from Guthrie Center to Creighton.
Sure. Well, I was a late bloomer. I was 5'4" when I started high school and under 100 pounds. So I loved I loved whatever sport was in season. I probably, maybe 8th, 9th grade gravitated more toward basketball. I played middle school football at that size and broke my collarbone twice in 8th grade. So I wasn't going out for high school football at that point. And but I played high school baseball and high school golf. But I grew, and so I grew probably more in love with the sport of basketball specifically. And yet, I didn't necessarily know that I wasn't an accomplished enough player necessarily to be recruited in high school. And my grandfather had gone to Creighton. My parents kind of pushed me. I was down to Iowa, Creighton, maybe one other school. And eventually they're like, well, just go to Creighton if you don't like it. And I was like, okay, but do you understand there's a difference in tuition at Creighton than in-state Iowa? But that's, they wanted what was best for me. So I came to Creighton. I continued to grow. Actually, I was probably about 6'1" when I graduated from high school or a little more, and I grew to about 6'3". I filled out, like a lot of boys do, and kept playing a lot of recreational basketball. And then by my junior year, Tony Baroni had come in. He had replaced Willis Reed as the coach, and they were a little short on bodies. So they had walk-on tryouts, and eventually I made my way onto the team. And then after I graduated, I had played golf. Bruce Rasmussen had been my golf coach the last couple of years at Creighton. And he was also the women's basketball coach. Back in those days, you did multiple things. And so I just fortunately had an opportunity to kind of volunteer. I didn't really know what I wanted to do even when I graduated. I kind of was toying with the idea to go to law school, but I wasn't sure that's what I wanted to do. So I just took a job to take a job, which a lot of people do. That's why I tell our players now, don't feel like you're failing if you haven't figured it all out at age 22 or 3. But so in the course of that, I volunteered for Bruce, found out that I really liked coaching, and that's kind of how I got into it.
How many years total have you been at Creighton? Let's start with the 4 years as a student. How many years were you a volunteer and then an assistant coach before his entire path? He was a student here, then a GA, volunteer, and eventually moved on to Loras College with Connie Yori as an assistant coach, then returned as an assistant. And you've been here as the head coach 23 years. So
Right.
I've given you a little bit of time to think about that. How many years have you been at Creighton total?
Well, since I was 18, I mean, the only 2 years I wasn't doing something with Creighton were the 2 years I was at Loris, and I'm dang near 60. So
we're
you do
approaching
the math.
40. We're approaching 40 years.
So
Flan.
you do the math, Glenn. Yeah, I was at Loris. As you said, I was mostly a volunteer for Bruce. So Connie offered me so much money to be a grad assistant back in the early '90s up at Loris. But then I was there 2 years, and then Connie got, at that point, Bruce decided he wanted to get out of coaching and get into administration. So he became an assistant. Before he became the athletic director, he became an assistant athletic director for a couple of years. Connie was offered the job, offered the opportunity for me to come here. And then I was here 10 years as her assistant. She went to Nebraska, and I got hired to be the head coach, almost 22 and a half years ago. So year 23 as the head coach.
So I want to, as I said, I want to keep these podcasts around 20 to 30 minutes, and we're going to close the podcast with this particular question. What about Creighton has kept you here, and what about you has made you want to stay with Creighton? And that's something really that's going to take a little time to reflect about, and we'll probably touch on it again, but it will build the foundation for what the culture that you've created and how you've had this opportunity. And one of the things I think about when I talk about the culture of Creighton is we've had coming into about 4 years ago, we had a 20-year stretch without a transfer. Now in the transfer portal, that may change. We had a couple players leave during the year COVID struck in 20, and we had one player leave last year. And it wasn't, at no point was it animosity, but you've been able to retain players. And over the years, I came from a different school where you saw a lot of transfers. And I spent 10 years at that school. And that's not an attempt to denigrate the former school. It happens everywhere. But we've created this opportunity to keep people happy enough or keep them engaged enough to want to stay at Creighton. And maybe more impressive to me, beyond just staying, you've had players consistently graduate. The two players that left here graduated from their next institution. Emma, who left here this year, graduated first at Creighton and will get her master's degree. So if nothing else, you're instilling that importance of finishing your degree first and foremost at Creighton, but if not, then going to the next place and finishing it. The last player not to do so was over 20 years ago, and that was also the last transfer prior to 2020. So what about you drew you to Creighton, and what about Creighton kept you here?
Yeah, well, like I said, I kind of landed at Creighton because my parents had pushed me there, but I think I've stayed because of the impact it had on me, the affection I had, and the overall experience. I told you I was on the basketball team. I played on the golf team, but I had relationships with my professors. I just felt like there were so many things that made my experience great. Not perfect, for sure, but great. And I think when you have that experience, anytime something else maybe pops up in your head as far as like, oh, I would want to do that, or I'd want to go there, you reflect back on, I don't want to say Creighton transformed my life, because I had really good parents, and I feel like I was mostly on the right track when I got to college. I wasn't doing too many things that would have landed me in jail or whatever, but I just think it kind of crystallized a lot of the things that I felt like I wanted to do and be, and certainly proximity to home. My parents were still in Guthrie Center, 100 miles away, and I think just being, and my siblings all moved away, so there was part of me that felt, like guilty that my mom, after my dad passed, my mom was 100 miles away, and so that kept me here. I love Omaha. I think it's a great community. It's big enough, but not so big that it's, we don't have all the hassles and inconveniences of a super large city, but it's got everything you need, and a lot of friends here. So I think it's Creighton, but it's also Omaha. And I think my general goal is to give our players, or allow our players, to have the kind of experience that I had in terms of being well-rounded, to push them and demand from them, but also give them enough time to appreciate all the things that are great about Creighton, not just the athletic department. It's having a relationship with professors. It's having a good experience on campus and being able to, take advantage of the things that Omaha has that, a lot of smaller college campuses or college cities don't have. So I think sometimes it's giving them or acknowledging to them that their Creighton experience ought to be bigger than their Creighton basketball experience, and letting that play with them, because I think that just like my experience was such a balanced, good overall experience, I think that's what we get for our players for the most part, and they have the opportunity to have good relationships outside of basketball, and that's, I think, super important.
All right, well, that's a good stopping point for our first podcast. Thanks for joining us here today, and thanks to everyone listening to Behind the Culture with head coach Jim Flanery.